さようなら。私に高すぎます。自分の価値知っているでしょ。契約通り時間が終わります。これは締め切りで君の解放。
こんばんは、皆さん。So hey, um, this evening's cancel video is going to be about another 17th century poet. I almost mentioned him last week, and his name is John Dryden. As it turns out, he was England's first poet laureate. That's like prime minister before poets, sort of. I mean, I don't really know anyway. So, as always, let's start off with what Wikipedia has to tell me. John Dryden was an English poet, literary critic, translator, and playwright who was appointed England's first poet laureate in 1668. Now, the reason that I'm canceling him this evening is that Dryden, in his own time, was known as kind of a turncoat, or a traitor. So as it happens, he was very comfortable with the Commonwealth, but then he was also very supportive of the monarchy when it was reinstated. And then, I mean, he's really known for this part, which is writing a poem extolling Anglican Christianity, and then converting to Roman Catholicism and writing a poem about how good it was. Okay, so here's an interesting little detail from his early life. In 1644, he was sent to Westminster School as a king's scholar. His years at Westminster were not uneventful, and his first published poem, an elegy with a strong royalist feel on the death of his schoolmate, Henry Lord Hastings, from smallpox, alludes to the execution of King Charles I, which took place on 30th January 1649, very near the school where Dr. Busby had first prayed for the king. Returning to London during the Protectorate, Dryden obtained work with Oliver Cromwell's Secretary of State, John Thurlow. Now, is it just me, or does Thurlow kind of look like Sean Astin? So, at Cromwell's funeral on 23rd November, Dryden processed with the Puritan poets Milton and Marvell. Shortly thereafter, he published his first important poem, Heroic Stanzas, a eulogy on Cromwell's death, which is cautious and prudent in its emotional display. But not too cautious. Not too cautious. And here it is. In 1660, Dryden celebrated the restoration of the monarchy and the return of Charles II with Astraea Redux, an authentic royalist panegyric. In this work, the interregnum is illustrated as a time of chaos, and Charles is seen as the restorer of peace and order. Here we go. So just to give you an idea of what happens afterwards. Dryden's greatest achievements were in satiric verse, the mock heroic Mac Flecknoe, Absalom and Achitophel, 1681, the Medal, 1682. His other major works from this period are the religious poems Religio Laici, 1682, written from the position of a member of the Church of England, his 1683 edition of Plutarch's Lives, and the Hind and the Panther, 1687, which celebrates his conversion to Roman Catholicism. Now, this might seem patronizing since I don't know the second thing about this, but after the Restoration, Anglicans and Catholics did not get along very well in England. So you know, it's surprising, certainly on the face of it, that Dryden would convert, especially after writing a poem like that. But furthermore, as the article on the Hind and the Panther says, Dryden converted to Catholicism more or less simultaneously with the accession of the Roman Catholic King James II in 1685, which basically put the final nail in the coffin as far as his reputation was concerned. This was a man who supported the Commonwealth, the Restoration, Anglican Christianity, and Roman Catholicism only when said regimes were in power, which just looks really bad, quite simply put. So let's take a step back. With that being said, let's take a step back and look at some of the poems he's written. Let's just talk about the four that are most important here. There's a handy copy of Dryden's early works on Gutenberg.org, and this was edited by Reverend George Gilfillan. Here we go. So here it is. Heroic stanzas on the death of Oliver Cromwell, written after his funeral. So right there in the first stanza, he's describing Cromwell as a departed Roman emperor. This is not subdued. Dryden says, his grandeur he derived from heaven alone, for he was great ere fortune made him so, and wars, like mists that rise against the sun, made him but greater see, not greater grow. So, okay, it's a formal elegy, so, okay, he'd be a little eulogistic. But this isn't really quite guarded praise. And then he says, and yet dominion was not his design. We owe that blessing not to him but heaven, which to fair acts unsought rewards did join, rewards that less to him than us were given. So, which basically means that Cromwell was a hero who worked for the people. Right. I mean, I'm not saying he wasn't, it's just, this is quite flattering, isn't it? And then Dryden says, nor was he like those stars, which only shine when to pale mariners they storms portend. He had his calmer influence, and his mien did love and majesty together blend. So he was the absolute perfect helmsman. Oh, this one's really funny, just gonna mention this in passing. This is where he takes a dig at the Pope and says, proud Rome would dread the fate of Dunkirk heard, although in Alexander were her guard, as a Pope. Interesting. Well, people change as they get older. And as the footnotes here point out, Dryden was no prophet. Cromwell did not rest in a peaceful urn, as I hinted in my previous video. And it's funny because the very next poem in this compilation, this anthology, is Athrea Redux. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, I'm just going to go with what I'm saying. A poem on the happy restoration and return of His Sacred Majesty Charles II. I mean, really, it's not even funny. It's the exact next poem. And, this is where Dryden describes the time of Cromwell as youth that rejoiced at unacquainted being, envied grey hairs that once good days had seen. We thought our sires, not with their own content, had, ere we came to age, our portion spent. Nor could our nobles hope their bold attempt to ruined crowns would coronets exempt. For when by their designing leaders taught to strike at power, which for themselves they sought, the vulgar, gulled into rebellion, armed, their blood to action by the prize was warned. The sacred purple then, and scarlet gown, like sanguine dye to elephants was shown. Wow. And he describes the king. How great were then our Charles's woes, who thus was forced to suffer for himself and us. He, tossed by fate, and hurried up and down, heir to his father's sorrows with his crown, could taste no sweets of youth's desired age, but found his life too true a pilgrimage. Unconquered yet in that forlorn estate, his manly courage overcame his fate, etc., etc. And he's a perfect king. Banished David, God's anointed, and the poem ends thus. At home the hateful names of parties cease, and factious souls are wearied into peace. The discontented now are only they, whose crimes before did your just cause betray. Of those your edicts some reclaim from sin, but most your life and blessed example win. So yeah, as we're accustomed to saying, this is not a good look, right? Honestly, it's probably a little more damning than the other pair of poems that we'll look at. Now, in all fairness, I haven't really read the entirety of the Hind and the Panther. If I can get away with it, I won't. But let's start with taking a look at Religio Laici from 1682. Now, as you can see, there's a very lengthy preface where he explains that he's only a layman and he's describing his religious conviction from a layman's standpoint, that he feels that it's necessary for him to do so even though he's not an expert. Does that make him like me then? Now again, since I don't know anything, I have to look up Wikipedia for this, where it says that Religio Laici, or Layman's Faith, is a poem written in heroic couplets in response to the publication of an English translation of the... I don't speak French. Of a book by the French cleric Father Richard Simon. So anyway, the book that Dryden was responding to said that Christians would do better to base their faith on tradition rather than a book. And of course, through the poem, Dryden argues that trusting in the book is part of his faith. Now, it's an interesting poem, and it's rather, well, it's kind of argumentative. It's not very long. It's certainly not as some poems go, but it's probably just a little too long for me to go into it at length. Just one video. Well, basically he says that atheism sucks and natural religion is kind of based. That people don't go to hell if they haven't been given a chance to go to heaven, and so on and so forth. And towards the end, I think what he says is that while the Word of God might be corrupted by, through translation over the ages, what have you, that people with good sense reading the Bible specifically can still, make a good case for the tenets of the faith as Anglicanism held them. Ergo, one practicing Anglicanism had every reason and right to. Now to finish up, let's just take a quick look at the Hind and the Panther. Now this is way too long for me to go into in one video, unless I were to drag this into an entire class. Also, as I said, I haven't read the whole poem, and well, it's not very dense, but nevertheless, it would be much easier to just take a look at Wikipedia for just this one video. So as Wikipedia says, the poem seems to say that Dryden wanted this cohesion between Anglican Christians and Roman Catholic Christians in England. The poem describes the Roman Catholic Church as a milk-white deer, or hind, the Church of England as a panther, the Independents as a bear, the Presbyterians as a wolf, the Quakers as a hare, the Socinians as a fox, and I do not know what Socinians are, the Freethinkers as an ape, and the Anabaptists as a boar. The second part deals with controversial topics which I will not touch, and the third part argues that the Crown and the Anglican and Catholic churches should form a united front against the nonconformist churches and the Whigs. Whigs bad. Oh, maybe they were. What do I know? So anyway, two reasons that people didn't like the poem seems to be one, that Dryden was writing this after a conversion, shortly after a Roman Catholic king came to power, and two, that the idea of talking animals professing religion was kind of fantastic to its readers. But anyway, it does sort of point out, in conclusion, that Dryden did change colors. Was he a terrible person for doing so? Probably not. Maybe he was, as even that Wikipedia article mentioned, his stance directly contradicted James II's policy. And maybe when I have more viewers, I'll make a better video, a longer one, about what real scholars have had to say about Dryden changing teams. It is, striking, to say the least, especially in his early career, for him to be changing tone that way. Now, of course, it might have been the smart thing to do, but I think that the charge of being a turncoat, or being a traitor, does kind of stick. Whatever his reasons might have been, even the most noble, kind of was, right? And, okay, so maybe religion is something that he should have freedom of conscience on, which is something that he says in one of the prefaces. I think it was the preface of Religio Laici. I could be wrong. I have to check. But really, without pronouncing a final statement on the man of whether, leaving aside religion, he could have at least stayed true to one political stance, you have to admit he did really profit from changing teams. He was even the first poet laureate, so there's that. Towards the end of his life, he seems to have refused to change teams and was promptly removed from service. So there's that. So maybe up until then he'd done the right thing. But maybe that's just Machiavellian line of thought. Or maybe we could just go on like this all night, right? So let's leave poor Dryden at that. And maybe if I get more viewers, I'll get to bully him again. So with that said, thank you for watching.